Snoop Dogg, the rap icon, gets stopped from boarding his own private jet by a racist airport security guard. But what happens next? No one saw it coming. The twist not only stunned everyone on site, it sparked a national conversation. Don't miss this shocking turn of events. Like, subscribe, and drop your city in the comments. Join the movement. Snoop was standing on the balcony of his oceanfront mansion, eyes locked on the golden sunset melting into the waves. The city of Skyview stretched before him like a reminder of how far he'd come, from the streets to the skyline. Normally, that view brought him peace. But tonight, his mind was racing. He was on the verge of a decision that felt bigger than music, bigger than business. Owning a private jet had always been a dream, but not for the flashy reasons people might think. To most, it's about luxury. For Snoop, it was about freedom. The freedom to go anywhere, anytime. To connect, to build, to give back. This wasn't a trophy. This was a tool for his growing empire and for the communities he cared about. The idea hit him hard during a visit to a struggling school out in the heartland. He was performing for kids who barely had working projectors, but their energy was electric. It reminded him of himself, hungry, hopeful, overlooked. Cramped on a commercial flight back, the thought struck him. What if I had the means to reach these places more often? What if I could actually make change happen faster? This wasn't just a purchase. This was purpose. His phone rang. It was Jax, his longtime manager and friend. "Snoop, you still thinking about the jet?" "Yeah," he said, steady. "Not just thinking anymore. I'm doing it." Jax didn't hesitate. "Then let's go. I'll pull some options." And so it began. Snoop dove headfirst into the process, inspecting hangars, meeting with manufacturers, comparing models. Each jet more high-tech and polished than the last. But for him, it was about impact, not just the aesthetic. Eventually, he found it, the perfect jet. Spacious, sleek, long-range, loaded with the tech he'd need to travel deep into underserved communities. When he signed the papers, it wasn't about flexing. It was about the mission. His first time stepping on board? It felt like the start of a whole new chapter. Soft leather seats, wood finishes, panoramic views, but what meant more was the vision taking flight with him. He already had trips lined up, towns to visit, schools to support, lives to uplift. But on the eve of that very first flight, something happened at the airport that would shake everything. Stay tuned, because what went down next? Nobody saw it coming. The night before his first flight, Snoop stood in his living room, staring at a framed photo on the wall. It was a picture of his younger self, lanky, holding an oversized microphone, eyes full of hope and ambition. He smiled to himself. "You've come a long way," he muttered under his breath. But deep down, he knew this was just the beginning. With the lights off and the city quiet, he felt something stir inside, not nerves, but purpose. Tomorrow, he would take to the skies, not just as a superstar, but as a symbol of what's possible. What he didn't know was that his first flight would hit turbulence before the wheels even left the ground. Morning broke with clear skies and a quiet promise. The private airstrip in Skyview shimmered in the sunlight as Snoop's car rolled through the gates. He leaned back in his seat, soaking it all in. This was it. A new chapter. A new way to move, to connect, to serve. The jet, sleek, custom-built, and gleaming like a trophy on the tarmac, waited for him like a dream made real. As the car pulled up to the hangar, Snoop stepped out into the crisp morning air. Technicians and crew moved with purpose, prepping for takeoff. The breeze smelled like jet fuel and fresh grass. Everything felt right. Adjusting his blazer, he walked toward the jet with quiet confidence. This moment wasn't just for him, it was for anyone who'd ever dared to dream past their zip code. Then, "Hey, you! Hold it right there." The comm shattered. Snoop turned around, frowning. A security guard was walking toward him, stiff posture, hard eyes, clipped tone. This is a private airstrip. You're not supposed to be here, the guard barked. Snoop blinked, caught off guard. I know. I'm here for my flight, he said, pointing toward the jet. That's my plane. The guard let out a short, sharp laugh, more insult than amusement. Your plane? That's cute. Let me see some ID. Annoyed but composed, Snoop handed over his license and a laminated card proving ownership of the aircraft. The guard snatched the documents, scanning them, then glaring back at Snoop. This can't be right, he muttered. Then, louder, how exactly did you afford a plane like this? The question hit like a punch. Snoop straightened. He'd dealt with prejudice before, but it never got easier. I worked for it, he said, voice steady. Now if you're done, I'd like to board my flight. But the guard didn't budge. Instead, he stepped closer. I don't know what kind of scam you're running, but I've seen this before. You don't belong here. That was it. Snoop's jaw clenched. He towered over the man, but kept his cool. This isn't a scam, he said calmly. I own that jet. I earned it. And I have every right to be here. The guard crossed his arms. We'll see about that. I'm calling the police. Before Snoop could say another word, the man turned and radioed it in. Snoop stood frozen, surrounded by his own flight crew, all watching in uncomfortable silence. The pride he'd felt minutes ago drained out of him, replaced by disbelief, frustration, and a quiet anger. Sirens wailed in the distance. Within minutes, 2 police cars rolled onto the runway, lights flashing. 4 officers stepped out, their eyes scanning the scene. The security guard rushed to them, pointing and talking fast. Snoop took a deep breath. Stay calm. Stay collected. Let the facts speak. One of the officers approached. Sir, we're going to need to see your identification and proof of ownership for the aircraft. Snoop handed it all over again, slow and deliberate. The officer studied the documents. They look legit, he finally said. But we'll need to verify everything. Snoop nodded, barely containing his frustration. I understand, he said. But this is unnecessary. Everything you need is right there. The guard hovered nearby, arms crossed, a smug smirk still plastered on his face. The crew had backed off, giving the scene a wide berth, but their sidelong glances said everything. Snoop had gone from center of attention to being treated like a suspect. Minutes stretched into nearly an hour. And as he stood there, frustration growing by the second, old memories began to surface, moments he'd buried deep. Times he'd been underestimated, talked down to, or flat out dismissed, all because of the color of his skin. He thought those days were behind him. But here they were again. In broad daylight. On the runway beside a jet with his name on it. Finally, one of the officers returned, documents in hand. Everything checks out. You're free to go, he said, clipped, like the words tasted sour in his mouth. Snoop took the papers and locked eyes with him. That's it? No apology for wasting my time? For assuming I didn't belong here? The officer opened his mouth, but before he could answer, the guard jumped in. Look, we were just doing our job. You should be glad we're thorough. Snoop's temper flared. Thorough, he snapped. This wasn't thorough. This was profiling. And you know it. The smirk vanished from the guard's face, replaced by silence. The officers exchanged tense glances and quietly returned to their cruisers. No apology. No accountability. Just lights fading into the distance. Snoop turned back toward his jet. A moment that should have been a celebration now felt heavy, tainted. He climbed the steps in silence, his heart pounding with a mix of anger, hurt, and quiet resolve. As the engines roared and the wheels lifted off the tarmac, the thrill of flying felt distant. He stared out the window as the city shrank below, trying to push the incident out of his mind, but it stuck like a thorn. That guard's voice echoed. You don't belong here. Not the words, but the weight of them. The implication. No matter how far he'd come, no matter how much he'd built, some people still couldn't see past their own assumptions. Still didn't believe someone like him could own something like that. He gripped the armrest, jaw tight. Across the cabin, Jax watched him silently before finally breaking the tension. "You good?" Snoop turned, forcing a small smile. "I'm good," he said, but his voice cracked slightly under the weight of it all. Jax didn't buy it. "You don't look good." That was a lot." Snoop's smile faded. He looked down at his hands. The strength in his shoulders was still there, but it felt heavy. "Yeah," he admitted quietly. "It was." Jack set his tablet down and leaned in. "You don't have to carry it all, you know. What happened back there, it was wrong. Anyone could see that." Snoop nodded, appreciating the words, but it didn't dull the sting. "It's not the first time," he said softly. "You'd think I'd be used to it by now." "You shouldn't have to be," Jax replied. "You worked for everything you've got. You earned that plane. You earned your success. No one gets to question that." His words rang true, but they stirred something complex in Snoop. He'd always prided himself on resilience, on staying cool, on letting his work speak for itself. But this time felt different. This time, it cut deeper. As the jet leveled out above the clouds, Snoop's mind wandered back to a memory he hadn't visited in years. He was 8 years old, sitting in a classroom at Sunrise School. It was career day. Every kid stood up to share their dream. When it was his turn, he stood proudly and said, "I'm gonna be a big-time rapper." The room erupted in laughter. Even the teacher had smiled, almost kindly, and said, "That's a nice dream, but maybe you should pick something more realistic." That moment stayed with him. Not just the laughter, but the message behind it. That dream's too big for someone like you. And now, all these years later, with the dream not only realized, but flying at 30,000 feet, he was still being told he didn't belong. A bitter cocktail of emotions stirred inside him: anger, hurt, disbelief. Jax's voice broke through the silence. "Snoop, what are you gonna do about it?" Snoop looked up, caught off guard. "Do about what?" Jax didn't blink. "About what happened. The way they treated you. You just gonna let that slide?" His first instinct was to shrug it off, focus on the positive, and move forward. That's what he usually did. But this time, letting it go felt wrong. This wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had ever been judged by their appearance. Every person made to feel like they didn't belong, even when they'd done everything right. "I don't know yet," he said quietly. "But I can't let it slide. Not this time." Jax nodded, his voice calm but firm. "Maybe this is your moment to speak up. To show people that this isn't okay. That we're not just gonna keep swallowing it." His words hit deep. And they stuck. As the plane soared toward Riverton, the anger inside Snoop began to shift, slowly, deliberately, into resolve. The flight landed without issue, but the morning's events clung to him like a shadow. Still, as Snoop stepped off the jet, he was greeted by a group of local organizers, wide smiles, warm handshakes, genuine excitement. One of them, a woman named Clara, led him to a group of kids waiting nearby. Their eyes lit up the second they saw him. Their voices spilled over each other as they shared their dreams and asked him questions. And in that moment, Snoop remembered why he did what he did. But even with the laughter and the joy around him, that guard's voice still echoed in the back of his mind. "You don't belong here." Later, in the back of a car heading to his next event, he opened his phone. Paused. Took a breath. Then hit record. His voice was steady, but heavy with emotion. Today was supposed to be a celebration. My first flight in the jet I worked my whole life for. But instead, I was met with suspicion. Hostility. Not because I did anything wrong, but because of how I look. He looked into the lens, no music, no edits, just raw truth. This isn't just about me. This is about a system that still judges people by the color of their skin, no matter how far they've come. I'm sharing this because I know I'm not alone. This happens to people every day. And it needs to stop. He ended the video with a promise. This isn't over. I'm gonna turn this into something good. For me. For you. For all of us. He hit upload. And just like that, the story wasn't just his anymore, it belonged to everyone. As the progress bar crept toward 100%, Snoop sat back, eyes on the road, heart beating fast. This wasn't easy. But it was necessary. He hadn't spoken up for clout. He'd spoken up because staying silent was no longer an option. By the time they reached the hotel in Riverton, his phone was buzzing nonstop. Jax met him in the lobby, eyes wide, tablet in hand. Snoop, you're trending. This thing is blowing up. Snoop raised an eyebrow and took the screen. The numbers were staggering, over 500,000 views in just 2 hours. Social media was on fire. Hashtag Flying While Black and hashtag Snoop Speaks Out were dominating timelines. Activists, celebrities, parents, teachers, strangers, all sharing their own stories. All standing with him. This is disgusting. How does this still happen? Snoop, you're an inspiration. Every time I think we've moved forward, something like this reminds me, we've still got work to do. But not all voices were kind. The trolls came too, predictable and loud. Here we go again. Playing the victim card. Maybe if you acted like you belonged, this wouldn't have happened. Typical celebrity drama. Must be nice to have those problems. Snoop scrolled in silence. Felt a flicker of anger. But then, he let it go. Because the message was louder than the noise. And the people who needed to hear it were listening. Snoop hadn't shared his story for the trolls. He'd done it for the people who understood. For the ones who needed to see that they weren't alone. By evening, the buzz was undeniable. News outlets picked it up fast, and Snoop found himself flooded with interview requests from national networks. Jack sat across from him in the hotel lounge, a whirlwind of calm hustle, eyes locked on his phone. BCN News wants to go live with you tomorrow morning. Eagle Times is asking for a written statement. And Lena Montague's team, they want you on her show. Snoop ran a hand down his face, the weight of it all finally sinking in. This is bigger than I expected. Jax looked up, his voice low but certain. That's 'cause it's not just about you. You opened a door that's been locked for a long time. And now people are stepping through. Those words stayed with him long after the room went quiet. That night, lying in bed, Snoop's thoughts jumped between past and present. He remembered the moments, some loud, some quiet, where he'd felt the sting of discrimination. Moments that marked him. Moments that stayed. He thought about the people who didn't have a platform. Who couldn't broadcast their truth to millions. And he thought about the future. What could he do, with this moment, with this spotlight, to make a difference? The next morning, Snoop stepped into the studio for his live interview on BCN News. The lights were warm, the camera steady, but his voice carried all the weight he'd been holding. This isn't just about me, he said. It's about a system that allows this kind of behavior to exist. I'm speaking out because I can. Because there are people who go through this every day and don't have a voice. That's who I'm doing this for. The interview was raw. Candid. And by the end of the day, the story had gone global. Social media exploded. Hashtags like hashtag Flying While Black and hashtag Snoop Speaks Out trended across platforms. Celebrities, journalists, everyday people, all sharing their own experiences and rallying around his message. One message hit Snoop particularly hard. It was from a young man named Marcus, a baggage handler at a small regional airport in Eagle Land. He wrote about being passed over for promotions, no matter how hard he worked, because his managers didn't see him as management material. At the end, Marcus wrote, "Thank you for saying what most of us can't. Your story gave me hope." Snoop read the message twice. His chest tightened. Marcus was one of many. But his story drove home the truth. This wasn't just about calling out injustice, it was about helping people believe they deserve more. As the hours passed, more activists, organizations, and leaders reached out, eager to turn the momentum into action. Snoop started to see a path forming, something real, something lasting. But not everyone welcomed the change. The management of the private airstrip released a carefully worded statement. They regretted any misunderstanding, but didn't accept responsibility. According to them, the guard had followed protocol. Snoop didn't flinch. He wasn't expecting them to get it. But that response? It only made him more determined. Real change wouldn't come from surface-level apologies. It would come from action. From pressure. From accountability. By week's end, what started as a single incident had become a full-blown movement. Protests were organized. Petitions circulated. Discussions about systemic bias dominated headlines and timelines alike. And Snoop? He was already planning next steps. He didn't just want to talk. He wanted to build programs, platforms, support systems for marginalized communities. Late one night, as he sat in his office reviewing plans for a new initiative, Jax walked in with a look on his face, half shock, half smile. "You're not gonna believe this," he said, holding up his phone. The airstrip just announced they're launching mandatory bias training. And the guard? He's been fired. Snoop looked up. A flicker of satisfaction crossed his face. Not a smile. Not a celebration. But a start. "Good," he said simply. "But we're just getting started." The chapter closed with Snoop standing at the edge of a new mission. What began as a moment of humiliation had turned into a movement for justice. The road ahead was long. But he wasn't walking it alone anymore. And he knew, this time, he was walking towards something bigger than himself. After the airstrip publicly announced mandatory bias training and confirmed the dismissal of the security guard who had profiled him, Snoop Dogg felt a small but meaningful victory. It didn't erase the sting of what had happened, but it marked a turning point, a spark of accountability in a moment that had been clouded by frustration and disbelief. Still, as messages from supporters and strangers began flooding in, many sharing their own painful experiences with discrimination, Snoop felt the weight of something bigger forming. He realized that what started as a personal moment of injustice had now grown into a national conversation. And it wasn't enough to just speak up. He needed to act. Fueled by a deeper sense of purpose, Snoop and his longtime manager Jax sat down to design something real, something that could bring change where it mattered. Together, they created Wings of Hope, a charitable initiative that would use Snoop's private jet not as a status symbol, but as a vehicle for service. The mission was clear: use the plane to help those in urgent need. Transport patients to hospitals. Reunite separated families. Give students access to education. And spark possibility in communities that had long been overlooked. The program also partnered with schools to offer scholarships and mentorships in aviation and engineering, opening doors for the next generation to not just dream, but take flight. The first Wings of Hope mission was a deeply personal one. A young girl named Maya, just 7 years old, was living in a rural town in Heartland. She'd been diagnosed with a rare heart condition, but her family couldn't afford the long, complicated trip to a children's hospital in Skyview. When Snoop's team called to offer a free flight, Maya's mother burst into tears. On the day of the flight, Snoop arrived early at the tarmac to greet them. His jet, now proudly bearing the Wings of Hope logo, waited like a promise. Snoop knelt to greet Maya, who held a stuffed bear tightly in her arms. "You ready for an adventure?" he asked with a warm smile. Maya nodded shyly, and her mother whispered through tears, "You're giving us hope." "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to," Snoop replied gently. This is what it's all about. That first flight wasn't just about getting from one place to another, it was about changing the course of a family's life. And it became the heartbeat of a growing movement. In the months that followed, Wings of Hope expanded rapidly. The jet delivered critical supplies to hurricane-ravaged communities. It transported families in crisis and hosted dinners in the sky, special evenings for students from underserved neighborhoods. Inside the cabin, usually reserved for executives, Snoop created an inspiring space filled with real talk, encouragement, and connection. At one of those dinners, he met Malik, a quiet teenager with a passion for aviation but no roadmap for how to get there. When Malik nervously asked, "Do you think someone like me could ever be a pilot?" Snoop smiled and said, "I don't think you can. I know you can. But you've got to believe it first." Those words stuck with Malik and others. Soon, stories like his began to multiply. With growing momentum, Snoop and Jax launched a pilot training program called Liftoff, offering mentorships, scholarships, and hands-on experience to young people who had the dream but lacked the opportunity. Snoop made it personal, meeting with every new trainee and reminding them, "You belong here." By the end of the year, Wings of Hope had completed over 50 missions, touched hundreds of lives, and inspired a wave of volunteers, donations, and community support. Media outlets covered it. Foundations reached out to partner. But through it all, Snoop stayed grounded, reminding his team, this isn't about headlines. It's about people. Speaking at universities, sharing his story with young audiences, and continuing to turn his own adversity into fuel for impact, Snoop had become more than a figurehead. He was a guide, a mentor, and a bridge between dreams and reality. Wings of Hope soon became a global symbol of compassion and possibility, proof that pain, when met with purpose, can build something powerful. And one night, standing on the tarmac beside Jax, watching the 54th mission lift into the sky, Snoop said it plainly. "We're just getting started."